Today I'm going to build an outdoor George Nelson inspired bench. Originally designed in 1946, this style of bench is an iconic example of mid-century modern furniture. Instead of showing you artistic shots of me milling rough lumber, let me show you what I've been up to lately. First, I built this massive, built-in bookcase and desk combo for my house. I also built some custom walnut decor to go along with it. Next, I built this solid walnut and metal side table with a built-in floating planter. I also made this ambrosia maple and steel leg desk for my friend Brandon. I'll be building another one and you'll see that in an upcoming video. Finally, I did some gardening to get ready for today's project. After 6 hours of milling and dealing with a little dust collection issue, we're ready to get to the first part of the build. This project is completely built out of white oak. You need 4 1x2 equivalent boards for the stretchers. The first thing you should do is go ahead and glue 2 of them together. Mine were 18 inches long, so I could cut them down to size later, after creating my joints. To begin cutting the joinery in the slats, I used an actual piece of milled lumber to set my blade height. This bench has 11 slats, and all 11 pieces get the same 3 joints cut into them. First, let's start with the center dado, then we'll move on to the 2 rabbets on each end of the piece. To create this center dado, I clamped a 3/4 inch scrap to my fence, and then set the fence so my blade would make my cut closest to the fence first. After the first cut established my edge, I would then work my board closer to the fence, slowly removing material. Once I was halfway through this cut, I could flip the board 180 degrees and repeat the process so my dados met in the middle, making a cut 1.5 inches wide. To cut my outside rabbets, I set my fence so the blade would first establish my inside line, and then I slowly worked my way to the outside of the board to complete the rabbet. Finally, I cleaned up my cuts by slowly running my piece over the very top of the blade. Ideally, you would either use a dado stack or a flat bottom blade to make this cut. Now that all 11 of my slats have been cut, I can move on to the stretcher joinery. After waiting for my first 2 pieces and clamps to dry, I took the glued stretcher and the 2 non-glued stretchers and taped them together so I could make all my half-lap joints at once. These joints will mate with the slats we just cut. Taping the pieces together allows you to make the cuts quicker and have 100% matching pieces. Preferably, you'd use a dado blade and create essentially a box joint jig for these cuts, but I found my method of laying out the joints and slowly cutting away the material to work just fine. I always made my cuts on the small side and slowly enlarged my dados until the pieces fit. The best way to make these cuts is to first establish the outside edges of the grooves and then remove the material in the middle. I also went ahead and sanded the sides of my slats before moving on to the glue up. I recommend doing this glue up in 3 stages. I first glued up the center section and used a caul to pull all of the slats in tight. For the edges, you want to be sure to provide clamping force from all 3 axes. I used parallel bar clamps to push the stretchers into the slats. I put a steel caul across the top with 4 F-clamps to pull the slats down into the stretcher. Finally, you'll see I used a larger F-clamp to pull the outside slats into the middle so nothing drifted. I got the idea for this glue up from Johnny over at Crafted Workshop when he built a similar Nelson bench, so I just wanted to give him a huge thank you for helping me with this glue up. With the top end clamps, I went ahead and moved on to my legs. These are made out of 1x3 equivalent boards. The trapezoidal shape of the legs is made out of all 8-degree cuts. For the assembly, I first marked a line 3/8 of an inch on my vertical pieces, and then I marked 3 equally spaced holes. I used a 3/8 of an inch Forstner bit to create a recess that I can later plug with a dowel on the 2 outside points. Once the whole trapezoid leg assembly was put together with glue and screws, I went back with that same 3/8 of an inch Forstner bit to drill a hole for a dowel to go through the vertical and horizontal leg pieces for some extra structural integrity. I used my flush cut saw to trim the dowels and rub some fine sawdust to close up any holes that may have been left behind. Overall, these leg assemblies ended up being extremely strong, and I'm very happy with how they turned out. Now all that was needed was a lot of sanding to get the legs ready for finishing. I used India ink to ebonize the legs, and I prefer India ink over black stain because I believe it is a deeper and truer black that really pops the grain. In total, I did 3 coats of India ink, 1 hour apart. I did 5 coats of a spray-on shellac to lock in the ebonized color before I put on my top coat of polyurethane. I coated the legs with 7 coats of an outdoor oil-based spray polyurethane. When those dried, I moved on to flattening up my top. I spent several hours with 80 grit sandpaper and my random orbital sander to get the top completely flattened out. If you haven't already, click subscribe. It's the best thing you can do to help me continue to make free content on YouTube. To fix some of the gaps from my original milling, I mixed up some white oak sawdust with some wood glue and created my own wood filler. I filled in all the gaps with this mixture and sanded it down. It hid all of my imperfections very well. I then glued a piece of 120 grit sandpaper to a 3/4 inch scrap of plywood and used this to sand the inside edges of all my glue joints. Now that everything had been flattened and all the imperfections and joints had been cleaned up, I could spend some time with some 120 and 220 grit sandpaper. I eased all of the edges and still maintained a sharp line with a sanding block and 220 grit sandpaper. I finished the top with the same spray-on oil-based polyurethane, making sure to get in all the nooks and crannies in between the slats. I sprayed a total of 5 coats on the bottom and 7 coats on the top. Finally, I attached my legs to the base, first pre-drilling the holes, and then I used deck screws since this will be outside. I made sure to stagger the screws inside to outside for extra stability. I put on some hard plastic feet just to keep this elevated out of any standing water that happens to be on my porch when there's a rainstorm. I'm super happy with how this project turned out, and I really think it makes the look of my porch. The natural white oak contrasting with the ebonized legs just looks fantastic and really shines. I can't wait for some nice days so I can sit outside and read a book or just hang out with our dogs. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Combs Design. Check out my other videos for content and furniture builds just like this.